Hello. Hi. Hi, good afternoon, friends of the staking and Ethereum community. I know we've just had lunch. It's the beginning of DevCon, so I'm going to try to keep my talk about econometrics to a minimum. So as the panel before me was already talking about, one of the most pertinent topics today in Ethereum is whether or not we want to reduce the issuance curve. And it's something that's been broached by, I think, the Ethereum Foundation from, at the very least, the beginning of this year. And there are two sides of the argument, of course. On one hand, I think Drake, Vitalik, a few other people, they think that right now, even in the beginning of the year, when the staking ratio was around 24.8%, they thought that maybe Ethereum was already overpaying for security, that the optimal amount was around 25%. It's since gone up to 30%. So in a way, the topic becomes even more imperative for us to talk about. And then the question becomes, if you reduce it, is it becoming more efficient in terms of the security, the amount you're paying for security? And also, does it improve Ethereum in terms of increasing the real value of ETH, which is something that will prove to be very important? On the other hand, there's the argument that maybe reducing the yield would actually hurt decentralization. And to the extent that solo stake is actually more adversely affected by it, by reducing the yield, you actually hurt decentralization. So this is actually something that me and my colleagues at the Center for Cryptoeconomics in Switzerland, thanks to a grant from Cyberfund, have actually been studying. And at its core, it's actually an empirical problem. Because if you look at it as an economist, you're thinking, if you're talking about the supply curve for stake ETH, right? You look at the overall supply curve for the overall population, and then you look at the supply curve for these solo stakers, the question of decentralization then becomes, how do the slopes of the curves actually compare? Because if the supply curve for the solo stakers are actually flatter, then it means that when you have movements in the yield, there'll be bigger numbers, proportionally bigger numbers of the validators that are solo stakers leaving. So decentralization will be hurt. So essentially, this becomes a problem of how do we estimate the shape of the supply curve for validators, for the overall population, and for solo stakers. Now, without boring you guys too much, the thing is you can't just go and run a straightforward regression. Why is that? That's because what we observe in the market is basically, as Econometrics 101 would teach you, it's a combination of both demand and supply interacting. You have, for example, you're going from point A, where demand is there, supply is there, and then the next observable point, so to speak, is a result of both demand and supply moving. So you're going from A to B, right? You're going from there to there. It doesn't tell us anything about the shape of the supply curve because it's reflecting, movements and interaction of both curves. So the question then becomes, how do we estimate this properly? In econometrics, this problem is called endogeneity, but to spare you guys the tedium, I'm just going to tell you, the solution is something that's actually been invented in economics, in econometrics. Not too recently. It was actually first published in a paper in 1928. So almost 100 years ago now. And it goes to show that sometimes, even looking back, some of the things that we want to study in crypto has actually been maybe already studied in other fields. We just need to implement maybe the knowledge and the method to this sector as well. So the way you do it, essentially, is you want to use what you call instrumental variables. Variables that basically capture variation in only one variable and not the other. Let me try not to bore you guys too much with the diagram. But essentially, if you can have a variable that varies only with the demand for stake ETH, you basically have something that shifts the demand curve, like from D0 to D1, essentially you can trace out the supply curve. Because what you're doing is you're capturing variations first in the number of validators that depends on changes in demand for stake ETH. And then when you have what's left, you basically already isolated the demand effect from the supply effect. You can use it to estimate the shape of the supply curve. So the real question for us, for me, because I was the one leading this part, was basically, what's a valid instrument? What's a valid instrument for the demand for the protocol, for Ethereum, sorry. Well, I would argue, and if you think about it, maybe it's Very straightforward. When I go to the shop, what's my demand for a T-shirt? It's my willingness to pay for a T-shirt. How much money I have, how willing I am to fork out cash for a T-shirt or for a drink at the bar or whatever. So what's the demand for stake ETH? It's what the protocol is willing to pay for security. And what is a way to capture shifts in that? Well, I would say that the Ethereum Improvement Protocol proposals, the so-called EIPs, these are the things that capture the shifts in that. Because not every single EIP, but some of them, for example, Shapella, they represent tangible shifts in the reward that validators get. Prior to Shapella, you couldn't make withdrawals. With the combination of Shanghai and Capella, you could actually push withdrawals from the beacon chain to the execution layer. Now, yes, people staking before expected rewards, but unless you had complete blind faith in Ethereum, you would still discount it a bit because it wasn't a sure thing just yet that you're going to get the rewards. But also, even if you were going to preclude that argument, there's still the argument that, well, to the extent that there's a time value of money, to the extent that you can stake things and get, interest back, which of course you can in DeFi, as long as there's some kind of indefinite waiting period until you get the ETH back, that's still going to be discounted heavily, or at least to some degree, compared to if you can just enter the, the withdrawal queue, or there's like an automatic sweeping of withdrawal for rewards. So to that extent, EIP 4895, part of Shapella, represented a rightward shift of the issuance curve, a rightward shift of the demand curve. So basically, it's one example through which we can trace out the supply curve. Now, so what I did was we looked up all the EIPs that basically represented rightward or leftward shifts of the demand curve, and we used them as dummy variables. Not to bore you, but basically they're variables that either go from 0, they start off at 0, and they go to 1 after some date or some epoch is reached. So you basically divide between the period before and the period after. Now, the idea is that by doing that, we can isolate out the effect of the changes in, in ETH, in the number of validators, due to demand-side shifts from the protocol, how much the protocol is willing to pay for stake ETH. And what's left gives us information to trace out the supply curve. So these are some of the results. We have a lot more, but I'm showing you guys the tip of the iceberg. Essentially, there are two main results here, and they're non-trivial. The first one is that the shape of the supply curve is indeed upward sloping. This is non-trivial because, yes, normally supply curves are upward sloping, but the Ethereum protocol basically reduces issuance when the number of validators actually increases, which means that if we couldn't control for the demand effect, what we would get would be a negative curve. So the coefficient for actually the overall would actually be significant and negative. Here we got a positive one. So it tells us that we managed to successfully control for the demand shifts. Now, I think I might be belaboring the point a bit, but it's worth emphasizing that in the beginning, what I used for the instrument was actually the real reward rate of ETH. I didn't use dollar reward, I used real rewards. And what we got were actually negative and significant coefficient. This tells us two things. One, it tells us that possibly, if you're using just real reward rate, it doesn't successfully capture the variation in supply decisions. And the second thing it tells us is that, well, maybe no surprise to any of you guys, I'm preaching to the choir, but what people care about is not real reward rate for ETH, not how much ETH is issued relative to inflation. What people care about is the dollar return of ETH. Because until we live in a vacuum of Web3, I need to buy stuff, I need to pay rent with fiat. So ultimately, what we still care about is the dollar reward. When we switch from using real reward rates to dollar reward rates, which was actually very conveniently already provided from the staking rewards API. Thank you very much. We actually wind up getting a positive and statistically significant coefficient. The p-value is very low. It's significant at basically 0.1%. And the second thing that we found, as well as the fact there's a positive coefficient, which is that when you reduce yield, the number of validators go down. When you increase yield, all else being equal, the number of validators go up. We found that the solo stakers were less sensitive. What does that mean? Less sensitive would tell you that given a particular change in dollar reward rate, real solo stakers tend to react proportionately less. Now, this would on the surface tell you that decentralization would not be hurt. That if you reduce real reward rates, what you get is solo stakers quitting by a smaller proportion. But before you all start throwing things at me, this was only the tip of the iceberg, and we studied this a lot more. And what we found was that, for one, if you use different instrument variables, we use gas prices, for example, you could have the opposite of finding. But the other thing we found was that if you look at actually big movements in price, you look not at like single-digit or like, you know, low percentage point adjustments in dollar reward rates, but you actually look at like a crash in ETH. For example, you can look at January 3rd this year when ETH price fell by 14% in less than 2 hours. If you look at things like that, looking at the period before and the period after, the number of solo stakers actually adjusts negatively and also more aggressively than the overall population. What does it tell you? It tells you that basically for small changes, maybe solos, because of altruism, as the EF actually postulated, they're more resilient. But beyond a certain threshold, and we tried this for other percentage points as well, beyond a certain threshold, when you hit double-digit percentages, not percentage point, but percentages in terms of adjustment in ETH prices, then solos start to react more aggressively. And therefore, I think that if you look at that and you combine it with what they're talking about now with the endgame issuance reduction, the picture we get is that the answer, and I hate to be an economist about it, as the guys before were saying, the answer is not whether decentralization would be hurt or not. The answer is that it depends. For small changes, maybe not. For big changes, absolutely. And that is why I think that that's something that, you know, we need to think about, we need to discuss, and also it probably rules out some of the solutions being, being offered right now, such as, for example, reducing issuance to absolutely zero or something that's very close to it, because beyond a certain point, especially over longer periods of time, solo stakers would actually exit. Just some closing points here, and our paper will be published very soon with more, with more detailed analysis and also with more detailed data in terms of the different regression results as well. I also want to add that we reproduce this result from staking rewards data, but also with data from rated as well, and over slightly varying time periods. So it is something that we think is relatively robust. So there are things that you can still look at. For example, we can look at solo stakers organized by the number of validating nodes they hold. The idea being that obviously if you hold more, you benefit more from economies of scale, so maybe you're less likely to exit. Also, the thing that we looked at was that, especially with our theoretical model supporting this, the longer the time frame of reaction, because fixed costs become variable costs, solo stakers are likelier to exit over time. So therefore, just because it doesn't look like decentralization is hurt straight away, it might be hurt over longer time intervals as well. And as I pointed out, different instruments could be used. And when we use gas prices, we found that even in the short run, solo stakers were not as inelastic as it looked to be the case with EIPs. Now, just to conclude, because I think I ran over a little bit here. As I pointed out, I think they say, you know, the thing with economists is like any economist tends to have, you have one economist in the room, you have two opinions. Or if you have a very good economist, you might have three opinions. Unfortunately, I can only offer two. But one of the things that I love about our community, about Web3 in general, especially about Ethereum, the staking community, is the spirit of collaborative innovation. And I think that if nothing else, I hope that with my research, with my talk, I could spur future research in the field so that we can have more opinions and more conversations, and that we can work together towards a more secure, more sustainable, maybe more profitable as well, proof of stake. Thank you.